Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to class. Please grab a seat. So I read the reviews this morning, so thank you to everyone who submitted reviews. Most were very positive, so I really appreciate that. There were a few that were kind of funny. Two stood out to me. Obviously, they're all anonymous, so I'm not outing anybody. But one person said, and this one was a little concerning, "I am an effing academic weapon," and then hundreds of exclamation points. So, if that was you, please seek professional help. That's all I have to say about that. Another one said, "Awesome. He is a very funny and efficient teacher. His jokes almost make me laugh." So if I see someone like smirking, just not quite, then I'll know that's the opposite. So. But jokes aside, I appreciate the kind words. As I've mentioned, this is kind of my favorite thing to do, so I appreciate that most of you are enjoying it. And obviously I don't give a review of the students, but this has been a great class to teach. You guys have been much more engaged than I was anticipating. I've really appreciated the comments and questions. That makes this a lot more fun to teach, so thank you to all of you for that. Okay, a little bit of housekeeping. So, reminder, the APA assignment is due this Thursday at 11:59 p.m. I put up an announcement of some kind of reminders and some answers to common questions that I had received. And one thing I'll remind you of is keep it short. It should not be longer than a page. One paragraph is fine. I'm basically just marking it on, does this make sense? You get 2 marks out of 10 for your writing. And I'm not going to be picky. It's just going to be, did you summarize the article? And can I basically read it? Most of the marks come from doing the APA formatting correctly. And on that front, just download the template and edit it. So. Oh, and one other thing, I forgot to say this in the announcement. Pick your own title. I thought that would have gone without saying. Someone submitted really early and they kept the title in the template, even though they had a totally different article. Write your own title. That should have gone without saying, but I'll say that as well. One other piece of housekeeping. So the test is a ways away, test number 3. It will be on 3 chapters. Instead of 2, and so it will be longer. It will be 60 multiple choice and 1 written. I mentioned this on the first day, but I'm reminding you now, just so you can be thinking about that. So if you're really crunched for time for tests 1 and 2, study a little more. Be kind of ready for that, because you'll have the same amount of time as you did for test 1 and 2, but it is a little bit longer. And then test 4 will be a cumulative final, and it will be 70 multiple choice and no written. And apologies for my throat. Okay. So we'll jump back into sensation and perception. We're just going to quickly wrap that chapter up, and then we will move on to the chapter on consciousness. So we finished just before the section on perception of movement, and here I don't have too much to say. The one technical term in this section that you have to know is stroboscopic movement. Stroboscopic movement. It's in the key terms, but I'll write it on the board. Stroboscopic movement. This refers to the fact that when we see a series of images that are all slightly different, we perceive that as movement. Obvious example of this, movies. You watch a movie or a video, there's no guy up there moving. It's just one picture, then another picture, then another picture, but your brain perceives this as movement. That's all stroboscopic movement refers to. Pretty simple idea. I don't have too much to add to that. The book concludes with a discussion of different illusions. Illusions are, of course, misperceptions about the way the world is. There's one that the book doesn't talk about, but I'll just mention it because it gives me great humility about how much we know in psychology and that's the moon illusion. The moon illusion is just that the moon appears larger when it is on the horizon than it does when it's in the middle of the sky. So if you look at the moon in the middle of the sky, it looks like a dime, and it's closer to the horizon, it appears larger. Even though it's not closer. It's not closer, but it appears larger. The only reason I'm mentioning this, we still don't know why that's the case. If you go onto Wikipedia, you'll see that there are lots of different theories as to why this is, and there is not expert consensus. And that gives me great humility about psychology, because that seems like a pretty simple problem. Why does the moon look big when here? And we don't know. And here I am in my lab trying to figure out why people make certain reactions to moral dilemmas. If we don't even know why the moon looks big, I feel pretty hopeless about what I'm studying. But, so anyways, that's that. I just mentioned that as a point of humility. One illusion that we know more about, and there's some really good work on, is the Muller-Lyer illusion, which the book does talk about. So focus on the lines in the middle, so not the triangle-y part, just ignore that. Which line appears longer, A or B? Who thinks line A appears longer? Who thinks line B appears longer? Nice. There's always one. So that's not true though. The lines are exactly the same. And if you don't believe me, you can go home, Google it, get out a ruler. Line A and line B are exactly the same line, even though it seems otherwise. And it's pretty shocking that we get something that simple wrong. Oh, and by the way, the term Muller-Lyer illusion I added to the key terms. So if you re-download the key terms, I also added like 1 or 2 terms to chapter 6. So make sure you download that. And you can just add Muller-Lyer illusion right now if you want. One other interesting thing about the Muller-Lyer illusion that I briefly mentioned in chapter 1. This illusion, or susceptibility to this illusion, differs by culture. And to some of you that might seem impossible. How could it be that the environment you grew up in could change whether you see those 2 damn lines as the same? But it turns out it can. If you grew up in a non-industrialized context, you are less susceptible to this. And here's the standard view as to why. If you grow up in an industrialized modern context, you are more used to seeing things like this. And the visual cortex does change in response to the kinds of things that you see all the time. Remember that the brain is always making kind of guesses and predictions about what it's going to see next, and past experience shapes the kinds of guesses that the brain tends to make. So if you look at this, in this case, the line is closer to you. In this case, the line is farther away. And if it's farther away, your brain has to kind of go, okay, it's longer than it looks. It may look small on my retina, but it's farther away, so I'm going to exaggerate how big it is. That's the basic explanation for why the Muller-Lyer illusion is what it is, because we get exposed to scenes like this a lot. But if you're in the highlands of Papua New Guinea, there are not a lot of right angles in nature, so you tend not to see stuff like this. Okay. Any questions about this or anything from chapter 5? Because that's all I got for chapter 5. Okay. So that's all I've got to say about that. We will now move on to the chapter on consciousness, chapter 6. So the chapter begins with a discussion of what consciousness is, how psychologists standardly define consciousness. And I'm going to tie this back to an issue that came up in chapter 1. And that's the debate between dualism and monism. Reminder that dualism is the view that there are 2 kinds of things, 2 components to the human person. There is a physical component, brain and body, all that stuff, but also a mind or soul or some extra, stuff. And monism, or at least materialism, the version of monism that the book is talking about, says that it's just the physical stuff. We are all just bodies. And the reason I bring this up is consciousness is probably the issue that is most used in contemporary philosophy to criticize monism. So I'm going to go into this a little bit. Chapter 6 in general is probably the chapter that I have the least expertise on. There's like a section on drugs and on hypnosis. So I'm going to add a little philosophy at the beginning. Now, this may make some of you angry, like, oh, I wish I hadn't given him a good review. He's going to add philosophy. But if you feel yourself dozing off a little bit, I will be nice, and on exam review day, I will roughly tell you what the question will be about the philosophy stuff, since I am going a little beyond the textbook. So we'll spend some time on this issue, and for any of you who are going into philosophy or taking philosophy classes, it may be of some interest. But with regard to what the book says, the way that it defines consciousness is it is awareness of internal and external events. So awareness of things in your body, of events in your body, and awareness of events and goings on in the environment. That's how, and that's very standard. That's how the book defines consciousness. The book mentions the philosopher David Chalmers and talks a bit about his view, and that's what I'm going to expand on a bit. David Chalmers is probably the most influential contemporary critic of monism or materialism. He's not necessarily committed to dualism. He's open to different possibilities, but in some of his works he has argued for dualism. But the book mentions him, and he is someone who thinks that monism cannot explain consciousness. And I'm going to say a bit about his view. Chalmers distinguishes two types of problems having to do with consciousness. The easy problems and the hard problem. These are two different problems to solve related to consciousness. The easy problems have to do with function and behavior. So why our brains and bodies react in the ways that they do to internal and external events. So take pain as an example, which would be awareness of an internal event, like an awareness of a bodily state. So, I touch the hot stove, signal goes out to my brain, it causes me to go, ow, that really hurts, and to wince, and to move away from the thing. And the easy problem would be about how I'm able to react in that way. How I'm able to pull away, say, ow, that hurts, and all that stuff. And easy problem here doesn't mean easy. It means solvable by the standard methods of science, right? You can imagine science telling a story about how the brain processes the incoming signals and enables you to pull away and say, ow, that hurts, and so on. And in fact, we already know some of the mechanisms there from chapter 3. We may not know all the details, but we already have a pretty good idea of what's going on. To take another example, think of color vision. So the easy problem would be about how the light goes into the eyes, gets sent to the occipital cortex, it processes the signal, it can discriminate what has long wavelength or short wavelength, it can send signals to your Broca's area and to your motor cortex and make you go, that is red, or whatever, or move away from it in the right context. So all of that functioning, reacting, and behavior, that falls under the easy problems. It's easy to imagine how science could solve those. But for Chalmers, there's something that's left unexplained. There's something extra. And that's what constitutes the hard problem. In addition to my behaving and reacting and processing, there's the inner feeling of pain, right? When I touch the hot stove, it feels like something. It has a sort of qualitative feel to it, the painfulness, if you will. And when you think about it, it's kind of puzzling how it could be the case that a bunch of atoms bumping around in my head could give rise to painfulness. Sure, it makes sense that the atoms bumping around could enable me to pull my hand away. That's easy. But why would it make me feel pain? And if you've not heard this line of argument before, what I'm saying may sound strange, but here's one argument that Chalmers gives for this. And it will sound a little funny, but it's the idea of a philosophical zombie. Kind of a funny term. And it's actually a shame they picked this, because zombie has a different meaning in ordinary speech. A zombie is something that behaves and reacts in exactly the same way that a normal person does, but they have no inner awareness. Now, Chalmers and no one else thinks that these things are real. It's just a kind of thought experiment. Like, imagine there was a person who, let's say like my zombie twin, twin David. He talks like me, he reacts like me, he tells bad jokes like me. All of that is exactly the same, but there's nothing inside. No inner awareness. He's just behaving and reacting. And Chalmers asks us to consider, is that possible? Could you imagine that happening? Could you imagine a being that behaved like a normal person did, but didn't have inner awareness? And it seems like, yeah, you could imagine that. And one way of stating the hard problem is this. Why aren't we zombies? Why do we have this inner awareness? Why don't we just have behavior and so on that just goes on in the dark? Yes?
Well, because like a zombie, if a zombie touches a hot iron, it moves its hand away, but it still will likely touch the iron again later on. Humans, we think so that we know we're not going to touch our hand as it hurts.
Good question, or good objection, I guess. So, based on how a zombie is defined, the zombie would still not touch it later. So it still has, a brain. It's still processing information that's coming in. It just doesn't have the inner feeling of painfulness. Now, if you're skeptical that that's actually possible, we're gonna don't get me wrong. I don't agree with any of this. I'm just, I'm trying to give David Chalmers the best case that he can. For a long time, I took this very seriously. We're gonna get to the other guy who's kind of a critic of this. But if you are someone like me who's committed to the view that consciousness is just a matter of the brain, which is what I think, this should make you a little nervous. Yes, follow-up?
Sorry, then in that sense, don't you think like modern AIs and stuff or androids are zombies, I guess?
Well, they could potentially be in the future, if you take Chalmers' view, but even the best AI today cannot mimic all the behavioral responses of a human being. ChatGPT is pretty good with language stuff, but humans have far more behavioral responsiveness and reactions than just language. So there is no AI that has the functional complexity of a human being. Not yet, maybe someday. But that's also a good, although I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because that could take us down other routes. Okay, but that's Chalmers' argument. So this is probably the most influential contemporary defense of dualism or dualism's not there anymore, sorry, of dualism or criticism of materialism. So we'll watch a quick video from Chalmers, and then I'll say a bit about Dan Dennett, who's probably the most important critic of this, and then we'll keep going through the book. Okay, I'll stop there. He then goes on to talk about different possible solutions of the hard problem, but this is not a philosophy class, so we will not be going into that degree of depth. What I will move to is probably the most important critic of David Chalmers, and that's Daniel Dennett. These two are arguably the most important living philosophers of mind. Right? Philosophers who work on consciousness and issues like that. And here's Dennett's view in a nutshell. Now, his view requires a lot more work to really understand, but the short version is there are only easy problems. The only real problems that there are to explain are problems having to do with how we behave and react and so on. And our sense that there's this inner special awareness is an illusion. There is no special consciousness over and above the brain reacting in various ways. So that's Dennett's view. There are only easy problems. I will note in passing, we actually have a professor here at the psychology department who used to work with Dennett as a postdoc. Oh, yes?
I was wondering, do we consider like animals and stuff like conscious? Like where do we draw the line from other creatures?
Yeah, this is an ongoing debate. I mean, I think the standard view would be yes. Their consciousness is probably very different from ours. Language is very important to the way that we experience the world. But in the sense of reacting to pain or being able to experience color vision, there's every indication that animals are, at least mammals that are very closely related to us. Now you go down to an ant or to an amoeba, it's not clear exactly where to draw a line, and probably it's going to be a matter of gradation, not a sharp boundary. But yeah, good question. And if I go down that rabbit hole, it'll be we'll go even deeper. But so anyways, that's Dennett's view. Now, like I was saying though, if you go on into psychology, there's a professor here named Chris Westbury, who was Dan's postdoc. And I actually recently purchased Daniel Dennett's autobiography. He just published it, which should kind of give you a sense of which team I'm on. And Chris Westbury actually got an honorable mention at the end, like in the acknowledgments. So there's one little connection to the U of A. But just to say, to make it clear what Dan's view is, take pain as an example. So when we're in pain, there's various reactions that we have, various bodily reactions, right? We pull the hand away, we say ow, we form the desire that the state stop. And for Dan, desire is a functional term. Desire means you are inclined to behave in ways that stop the thing that's happening. So all of the, also it takes your attention, right? It takes your attention away from other things to the pain. But for Dan, there's nothing over and above that. It seems like there is. If you pay attention, it seems like there's something extra. There's this extra kind of magic inner awareness, but for Dan, that's an illusion. And just to briefly say, so why should we believe Dan's side of it? And of course, you don't have to do this. I'm just laying out the two sides. But one thing to think about kind of in closing is Chalmers concedes that physical mechanisms can explain why we behave in the way that we do, right? Why we pull our hand away, say, ow, that hurts, and so on. He just thinks physical mechanisms can't explain this magic inner awareness. But if that's true, then the inner awareness can't be the reason why you do anything. It can't be the cause of why you say, ow, that hurts, or so on. Because Chalmers concedes that physical mechanisms can explain that all on their own. So whereas Dennett thinks, no, we should define consciousness in functional terms, in terms of what it does, not as this kind of inner special awareness. Okay, we'll watch a quick video of Dan too, just so you can kind of hear from both sides. He looks a little bit like Santa Claus. He's got a very great white beard. I knew another professor who met Dennett once, and his kids actually thought he was Santa Claus. So we'll listen to Santa Claus for a bit, and then wrap up this part. Okay, and the end there is the key part, right? That the right way to think about consciousness. The right way to think about consciousness is the way in which it connects with behavior and reactions and things like that. Okay, now in closing, you don't need to decide who's right or to think very deeply about this, but one thing I want to say in closing is this chapter is about the easy problems. Whether Dennett is right or Chalmers is right, the only questions that scientific psychology in its current form can deal with are questions about functioning and reacting and behavior. If Chalmers is right, then the hard problem cannot be solved by standard scientific methods. You have to go metaphysical or something. If Dennett is right, then there is no hard problem. It's just an illusion. So either way, we're only dealing with the easy problems in this course. For the hard problem, you got to take a philosophy class. Okay. Any questions about this before we move on in the chapter? Okay. And again, if you're angry at me for having this section in here, I will let you know roughly what the question will be for the test, because this is a bit more advanced. Okay. So, for scientists, for scientific psychologists, we have to make consciousness measurable. We have to make it connected to something that's observable and measurable for the reasons that I was just saying. And this is a bit of review, but there are three standard ways of getting at consciousness. One is self-report. Now, there are some problems with self-report that we talked about in chapter 2, but oftentimes it's all we can use. So you just ask people, what are you thinking about? How are you feeling? What can you see? And so on. We can use various physiological measures. We can scan their brain, their heart rate, their galvanic skin response, which is kind of a measure of anxiety. And we can measure their overt behavior. I mean, of course, these two are kind of behavior in their own way. Like, this is behavior of the body, and this is kind of verbal behavior, but more overt behavioral measures you can also use. In my own lab, Kyle Nash's lab, we try to use all three. Kyle Nash believes in the importance of triangulating. He thinks that the best papers are the ones that have a self-report component, a neuroscience or some other physiological component, and if possible, a behavioral component. Okay. Next, we have to talk a little bit about Freud. Consciousness, unconsciousness, gotta talk about Freud, right? So on Freud's view, there are three levels of consciousness. Now, this is not like the three components of the human personality, like the id, the super-ego, that's a different thing. This is the three levels of consciousness. So you can think of it like, this is a common way of, common metaphor, you can think of it like an iceberg. The human mind is like an iceberg, where the water is, everything underneath that is not conscious, and whatever's above that is conscious. And for Freud, most of it is unconscious. Only a small portion of our mental processing is conscious. So above the water, that's the conscious level. I ran out of room, but okay, the conscious level. So all of the thinking that you are currently aware of. So right now, most of you, hopefully, are conscious of my voice. I was just talking about philosophy, so I may have lost a few of you, but for those of you who are still with me, you are conscious of my voice right now. Right now I'm conscious of my visual field, so I can see your faces, I see the book, and all that. I'm aware of my shoes are a little tight or whatever. All of that I'm currently aware of. Beneath that is the pre-conscious. The pre-conscious includes things that you are not currently aware of, but you could be aware of, if you so choose. Or so choose, whatever. If you wanted to be aware of them. So for example, before I say what I'm about to say, or let's say 5 minutes ago, you were probably not all that conscious about the uncomfortable chairs in this room. But now, you are all conscious of that. Right? So a few minutes ago, you were still, your body's still detecting that there's, you're sitting on a piece of shit chair, but that would be in the pre-conscious, right? Because you're not currently thinking all that much about it. And now I have moved it into the conscious level. 10 minutes ago, I was not thinking about the name of my first psychology instructor. And now I am. Dayar Asmaro, nice guy. Now I'm thinking about it. So before that, he was down here, now he goes up here. And within 5 minutes, I will have forgotten about him, and he'll go back into the pre-conscious. And then beneath that is the unconscious, which is things that you are not aware of currently, and you really can't be aware of. It's sort of systematically inaccessible to consciousness. So for Freud, all sorts of crazy stuff goes in there. Repressed sexual feelings for family members and repressed memories, all sorts of other bizarre stuff. Now, while contemporary psychologists reject a lot of that, there definitely is unconscious mental processing. And here's an example that you may not have thought about. language processing. At least if you're have spoken the language for long enough. Here's a challenge for all of you. And unless you are new to English, you will all fail at this task. I want you to, starting now, listen to the words I'm saying, but not understand them. Starting now. I'm saying a bunch of words, it's going into your ears, but you are unable to fail to understand what I'm saying. You cannot consciously turn off the language processing, right? You still understand what I'm saying. And that's because language processing is unconscious. It's not under conscious voluntary control. Because it's so well practiced, and we'll see later that things that are more well practiced they become automatic. They become inaccessible. Now, if you were, like for me, if I was listening to someone speak Spanish, I could very easily not understand it, because it requires a lot of deliberate effort to put it together, because my Spanish is very bad. So that's one example. Another example is priming. So there's a lot of priming studies. Here's a classic example. You have two conditions. In one condition, you give people a bunch of words related to the beach, like to unscramble or something. So, wind, towel, wave, and a bunch of words related to the beach. And then there's the control condition where you don't get beach-related words. Sorry? Oh, I thought I heard something. Okay. And then they do a bunch of random tasks later, and then you ask them, like towards the end of the study, what is your favorite detergent company? And people in the beach condition are much more likely to say Tide. They've been primed with beach words, and they are more likely, as a result, to say Tide. And if you ask them, hey, why'd you choose Tide? They don't say, because I saw all these beach words. They'll say, oh, it's laundry day, or oh, I saw it in the store the other, or whatever. They'll make something up, but we know that's not why. The reason they're making it up is the fact that the beach words made them say Tide is through unconscious processes. They're not aware of why they chose Tide. That's another example of unconscious mental processing. It's not the sort of thing that Freud focused on, but there's a lot of evidence for that. Any questions about this basic distinction? Okay. The book talks about a behavioral test developed by Gordon Gallup. I once wrote a paper on this test, actually, in undergrad. And this is a test for kind of self-consciousness, so more reflective, inward-looking consciousness. And it's called the mirror test. And here's how the mirror test works. You take the animal, and while it is sleeping, you put a little bit of lipstick or felt on its face, some kind of mark on its face, and you show it a mirror. And you look at, does it respond to the mirror like that's another animal? Or does it go, oh, there's something on my face, and try to get it off? That's some behavioral indication that it has some degree of kind of self-awareness. That it can tell, oh, that's not another animal, that's me, and try to wipe it off. And only intelligent and kind of self-conscious animals can pass. So obviously humans can, after about, I think it's 18 months or so. And various primate relatives of ours can pass, like chimpanzees and animals like that. But outside of primates, there are only 3 mammals that there's some evidence that they can pass. They don't want to guess. 3 mammals outside of primates.
Elephant?
Good, elephant. Yeah, elephant is one.
Dolphin?
Wow, this is a great class. Yep, that's the next one. Okay, number 3. So dolphin, elephant, and there's one other. Not dogs, sorry. Dogs and cats fail.
Bear?
Nope. It's related, it's similar to, it's a sea mammal. So dolphin was on the red track.
Orca?
Yes. So orcas, dolphins, and elephants, and primates like us. Those are the only ones that only mammals that there's evidence that they can pass. And you will all make my brother feel very bad, the fact that you got this so fast, because I once presented this to him, and I told him that 2 of them were sea mammals, and he thought of every conceivable thing you could think of. He eventually went to starfish. That's how desperate he was. I was like, how would that happen? So anyways, so good job to those of you who guessed it quickly. Anyways, that's an example of a behavioral measure of kind of self-consciousness. Okay. The next thing that I'm going to talk about is the distinction between controlled and automatic processing. And I'm going to add terms that the book doesn't use, but they likely will come up in your future psychology classes. And that's system 1, which is a synonym for what the book calls automatic processing. Or you could say unconscious. And system 2, which is controlled or conscious processing. These are a part of a view that's come to be called the dual process theory, according to which we have 2 kind of competing processes in our head. Quick, kind of automatic, intuitive thinking, and slow, careful, deliberate thinking. And here's an example of a test that's used to measure how much people rely on these 2. There is a baseball and a bat, like not an animal, but like a baseball bat. And together, they are $1.10. But the bat is $1 more than the ball. Now write down, how much does the ball cost? So you add them together, they're $1.10. The bat is $1 more than the ball. So write down your answer for how much the ball is. Take maybe 20 seconds, think about it. Okay, is anyone brave enough to say what they think the answer is? Yes?
5 cents?
Good job. Okay, so did anyone have a different answer pop into their head, at least initially? 10 cents is what pops into your head, right? So that's system 1. So the kind of, so maybe you have a very good system 2, but for most people, certainly including me when I first heard this, the answer that kind of pops into your head is 10 cents. But then when you pause and think about it, you're like, wait, if it's $1 more, well then it'd be $1.20 total. That can't be right. And then it's 5 cents. So, and you can actually use this. There's a set of questions like this that you can give to people, and many people say 10 cents. They just kind of go with their gut. And it's not IQ. It's not how smart people are. It's how much people rely on system 2, on slow reflective thinking. You can show that the test has validity independent of IQ. It's measuring something else. And people who say 5 cents, we would say, are more reliant on system 2. So that's one example. And actually, this is what I do in my own work. My own work relies on this distinction. There's a lot of work looking at moral psychology through the lens of the dual process theory. How many of you have heard of like the trolley dilemma? Most of you. So, the classic example is, there's a trolley coming along. You can pull a lever, and it's going to hit 5 people if you do nothing. If you pull the lever, it'll hit 1 person. I'm curious, how many people say you should pull the lever in that case? Not too many. Okay, not as many as I usually do. In the other case, where usually fewer say yes, is the trolley's going along, it's going to hit 5 people, but you are a trolley expert. And you know that if a man is large enough, he can stop a trolley all by himself. And conveniently, there's a very large man on this footbridge over the tracks, and he just requires a little push, and then you can stop the trolley and save the 5 people. How many think you should push the large man? Wait, more people? Okay, this is a very strange class. You guys just defy all statistical norms. I've literally never seen that. Pull the lever? Nah. Oh yes. So, I said at the beginning of the class that statistically, in a class of 300 people, around 3 will be psychopaths. Maybe a bit more in this class, I don't know. But anyways, so you'll like this part. The studies tend to show that people who say yes, you should push the large man to save 5, that they are more likely to have more reliance on system 2. They're more likely to kind of rely on slow, careful thinking. I won't go into my own work, but this is kind of like my starting place. I've done some other studies in this area. And here's one final example of the distinction. Think about learning a sport or learning a musical instrument. Now, I have no musical ability at all, but for those of you who I've heard that when you are first learning a musical instrument, it's very effortful. It's very system 2. It's right. You're very consciously thinking about it. When you're more good at it, when it's more well practiced, it's more system 1. You kind of just do it. You don't have to think about every note or whatever. And the same is true in sports. So I practice Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I've done it for a few years. And when I first started out, very system 2. And if you don't know, it's basically like wrestling, but with like chokes and arm blocks. So I'd be thinking about every move. But a few months ago, I was rolling, like sparring with someone, and I noticed that I was daydreaming. I was just kind of doing the moves from muscle memory. And that's true for other sports too. It's a very common experience that when you do something long enough, it kind of becomes more automatic and more system 1. Okay, any questions about the dual process theory? Yes?
Would that be the same for like coping mechanisms? The stuff that you start off doing as a kid and everything, you're very much thinking and everything, like, okay, there's yelling happening in the house, how am I going to distract myself, how am I going to do this, how am I going to do that? But as you get older and nothing really changes in your environment, you just kind of start to do those things like, almost like more naturally.
Yeah. I've never heard it connected to that, but that makes sense to me. The theoretical connection is pretty obvious to me. What you're talking about is learned helplessness, that you kind of just automatically think, I can't do anything about it. I mean, depending on what kind of coping mechanism you're talking about. But yes, I think that's a good application to make with that. Yep.
Why are these two systems like independent of IQ? Because like, I feel like thinking more consciously requires like more brain power, if that makes sense.
Good question. Actually, before I answer that, there's one thing I forgot to say. An easy way to remember which is which. System 1 is your first reaction to something. System 2 is that sober second thought. But to answer your question, I mean, there's different theoretical explanations you can give, but the basic answer is, as to why we know that it's independent of IQ, is the test's predictive validity is independent of IQ. You can statistically control for IQ, and it still predicts various outcome measures. You can think of it as, I mean, take this example, right? Everyone here can do the arithmetic required to figure out that it's 5 cents. You all have the, quote, IQ to figure that out. So it's not about how smart you are, it's do you have the tendency to go, wait a second, let me double check my initial intuition, as opposed to just, I'll go with my gut, it's 10 cents. That's kind of a goofy way of putting it, but that's the basic idea.
Thank you.
Any other questions about this distinction? Oh, I almost forgot, we do have a quick video. So this theory was put forward by Daniel Kahneman, 2 Daniels today, and might as well watch a quick clip of him explaining it. Kahneman is one of the few psychologists who won a Nobel Prize. There is no Nobel Prize in psychology, so we have to steal it from other disciplines. So Danny Kahneman got a Nobel Prize in economics because his work revolutionized economics and started a whole branch of economics called behavioral economics. But he is a trained psychologist, so we'll watch him talk about this distinction. Okay. So while Kahneman was talking about that, I forgot to mention that this will come up again later, not as a testable term, but just as something to kind of think about, we actually know the parts of the brain that tend to be involved in System 2, and one that has been very widely studied is a particular part of the frontal lobes, namely the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or DLPFC. And one of the coolest studies ever done was on those kind of trolley problems, where it's about should you sacrifice someone to save many, where many argue that people who say, yes, you should sacrifice one person to save many, tend to be more System 2 people. If you turn off the DLPFC with transcranial magnetic stimulation, you decrease how often they say, yes, you should sacrifice someone to save many. Very spooky finding. You can change people's reaction to moral dilemmas by turning off parts of their brain. Okay, that's all I have to say about that. Next, and this connects to what Kahneman said towards the end, divided attention is something we are not especially good at, especially if it is effortful attention. The book has a discussion of this, and this is a good opportunity for me to make a public service announcement, which is that obviously you all know that texting while driving is a very bad idea, precisely for this reason. We are not very good at dividing our attention, but even calling, even on a hands-free while driving, is also quite dangerous. And we'll watch another video about this, a little public service announcement. And you may think that calling, the main detriment is from holding it, but there's a few studies finding that the main issue is divided attention. So watch a video about that. And that will probably be the last video of the day, although we'll still have time to go through a bit more of the book. Okay, we'll stop there. Okay. So, this is not my area of expertise. I don't have too much to add to the issue of divided attention, but that should give you a sense of kind of the limits of attention. And this connects to what we said in chapter 5, right? It's easy to get the sense that you are always aware in detail of everything in your visual field, but in fact, you are only aware in detail of a small amount of it. The next section discusses a little bit about the neuroscience of consciousness. One section is about, it's a little bit of review, various parts of the brain that are devoted to detecting different kinds of things. There are various conditions that fall under the umbrella of visual agnosias, where agnosia is the inability to recognize something. So your vision is still in detail, but you can't make that connection that, oh, that's a tool, or that's my mom's face, or whatever. So one subtype, which you don't need to know the name, is prosopagnosia, which I've mentioned in passing, which is the inability to recognize faces. A lot of this capacity is in the bottom of the temporal lobe, which is, again, that's reviewed from chapter 3. The book also talks about the connection between consciousness and modules. So module is a term that we learned in evolutionary psychology, where a module is kind of a subsystem of the brain that is devoted to processing a specific kind of information. So it could be language, it could be, for the color red, it could be, for motor control. There's lots of different modules for different capacities. And it's tempting to think, oh, there must be the consciousness module. There must be some part of the brain that when the activity goes there, then it glows, and now you're conscious of it. But the standard way of thinking about it is not that. It's not that there's one magic part of the brain where the consciousness happens. It's when an event leads to more widespread activation, that's the event you're conscious of. So if you want to think about it like this, let's say this is the cortex, and it does generally happen in the cortex. Let's say so right now I'm not really thinking about what's over here, but if there's like a loud bang over there, I'm going to become aware of that. I'm going to look, what's going on over there? So, the bright light or whatever might start by being processed in the occipital cortex, and then it's going to spread more. And then it's going to, go various places. It might go down to the temporal lobe and say, oh yeah, that's a fire or something. It might go to my Broca's area and says, oh, you should mention that to the class. You should talk about it or whatever. And the more widespread activation the event causes, the more likely that event is to be the thing you're conscious of. Dennett, who I talked about at the beginning, has a nice term for this, fame in the brain, where the more famous an event becomes in the brain, fame of course in scare quotes, that's what you become conscious of. Various events are kind of competing for attention. They're sort of spreading activation, and the one that manages to get more activation going, that's what you're aware of. Okay. Any questions on this? Okay. So next we'll move on to circadian rhythms and sleep. So the beginning of the book or chapter is kind of an introduction to consciousness. The rest of it breaks down into kind of three parts: sleep, drugs, and hypnosis. These are three different kind of altered states of consciousness that we can have that differ from ordinary waking consciousness. But before that, I have to do there's a mandatory spiel that I have to give. I mean, it's not literally mandatory, but basically every intro psychology instructor will give this spiel. Imagine that there was a pill that could do all of the following things. It could improve your mood, make you happier. It could make your skin clearer. It could make you better at concentrating and better at remembering information. It would make it easier to lose weight. It would, all that. Basically, it would improve everything that you care about. And further, imagine that the pill was completely free. Presumably, you would all take the drug. And also no side effects. But some of you may know where I'm going with this. The pill is in fact free. It is called getting a good night's sleep. Sleep is good for exactly. So you're all first year, university students, so you may not be living up to this. But sleep is, and there's mountains and mountains of studies on this. A good night's sleep, good 8 hours when you're young, is good for basically everything that you care about. And it's free. Now look, I am human, I have a cell phone, and I know that the reels can just take away time. I'm not getting paid to say this, but I will make a quick promo. There's a great product on Amazon. It's like $40. It's a timed lockbox. You can enter in an amount of time, like 8 hours, for example. Put your phone in there, close it, and you cannot get it out for 8 hours. So if you're looking to improve your sleep, that is an excellent thing to buy. And don't believe the bad reviews. There's like a few bad reviews, but most of them are like, oh, this is bullshit. Like, I wanted my phone, so I broke it open with a screwdriver, and so it doesn't. It's like, that's not the product's fault. So if you don't do that, it'll work. It'll work fine. Okay. So that's the mandatory kind of spiel I have to give. Now, the section starts off with a discussion of circadian rhythms. A circadian rhythm is basically the body's internal clock. It's your body's kind of timeline for when to be more wakeful and when to start falling asleep. People, of course, vary with regard to how their circadian rhythms work, but we all have a kind of internal clock. The circadian rhythm is regulated by something called the, I hope I spelled this right, the suprachiasmatic nucleus. which is located, in the hippocampus, the hypothalamus. Remember that the hypothalamus is the boss of the hormone system, and hormones and neurotransmitters are of course involved in sleep. So inside the hypothalamus is this one part that kind of regulates when it's time to fall asleep or wake up. And what it will do is it will send signals to the pineal gland, which secretes melatonin. Melatonin, of course, leads to sleepiness. Or if it's closer to morning, it will send messages to have less melatonin be released. Fun fact, by the way, so we talked a bit about dualism this morning. Descartes, you may remember from chapter 1, who was a firm defender of dualism, he thought that the pineal gland was where the soul affected the brain. Because they didn't know a damn thing about how the brain worked, so he thought that's where consciousness kind of started. That was the point of connection. The reason he thought that is the pineal gland is one of the few parts of the brain that doesn't have something on both sides. It's kind of like just in the middle by itself. So he didn't know what it did, but he thought, well, it's in the middle. That's where the soul is. So anyway, I mean, I'm not blaming him. I mean, he didn't know any better, but that's what Descartes thought. So the way it works, and I think I have a picture of this. Oh, no, I don't. But the book has some charts of this. Basically what happens is the closer it comes to night, level of melatonin goes up and body temperature goes down. Then when it's time to wake up, the opposite happens. Body temperature goes up, melatonin goes down. Pretty intuitive connection. The book also has a discussion of early birds and night owls, and this is a source of great conflict. Great conflict in my. Oh, sorry. Yes.
So how does your brain know that it's morning?
So over time, in response to environmental inputs, the suprachiasmatic nucleus kind of learns to have a set timeline. So when you see light, if you're used to seeing light at a certain time, that's kind of the brain's way of learning, okay, now it's time to wake the body up. I'm sure you've all experienced jet lag, right? You go somewhere different, and at first your brain can't adjust, but after a while it kind of adapts and changes the circadian rhythm. But that's roughly how it works.
Also, all the benefits that you listed, like even after like you eat, would you like sort of get all those benefits?
Oh yeah. Sleep is good, or what I really should say is not sleeping is bad for all those things, even if you're over 18. Yep. Mountains and mountains of studies on that. We'll actually be talking a bit about it later when we talk about some sleep deprivation experiments. I forgot what I was saying. Oh yes, so morning, early birds and night owls. So in my family there's oh yes.
What about for people who it's like dark 24 hours?
It sucks. Don't live in a place like that. Is the real end. I mean, one thing to do is to expose yourself to a lot of light during the day. Same for when it's 24-hour day. Then you want to have times when it's really dark. Yeah. So living in a place like that or rotating shift work, which we'll talk about later, is just bad for basically everything. So if you can avoid having rotating shift work or graveyard shifts, I strongly recommend avoiding it. So, in my family, there's a big divide between the early birds and the night owls. My dad, huge morning person. His default is like bed by 9, up by 5, and I got those genes. So if I don't use my phone, like if I'm using the Amazon device, I'm bed 9:30, 10, up at 5. So those are the genes I got. My 3 siblings, they all got mom's genes. They're all night owls. And I made an interesting connection from the book. Apparently, being a morning person is more common in warm climates. And my dad's half Italian. And I asked him, like, did you get like the morning personness from your mom, who's Italian? And turns out, yes. So those are the only Italian genes I got, I guess. So that's kind of interesting. The book has a little bit of a discussion on that. Now, unfortunately, my brother, one of my brothers, Daniel, he thinks he's the best at everything. He's incapable of admitting anything. So one time he's like, no, if I wanted to, I could get up earlier than you without an alarm. I'm like, how? He's like, I will just will it. I'll just make it happen. And so I'm like, all right, obviously he didn't, but that's just his confidence. I mean, while we're on this, I mean, one time, if I don't get to make fun of my brother, what's the point of being a professor? Yes.
I don't think it's an experiment, but there was one, there was like this yoga camp, whatever it is, right? It was talking about the soul and everything, and the point is they meditate for a few weeks, and then at the end of the meditation, they have to watch the sunrise, but they can't set an alarm for it. So they have to just, like, purely out of like will or whatever, or the power of your soul, or however it works, you just wake up and you like know when the sun is rising.
Yeah,
Is there anything?
yeah. I'm not. I'd have to look at the study. I have no idea. Yeah. But yeah, all I was gonna say was, yeah, like I said, there's no point of being an instructor if I can't tell funny stories about my brother. So speaking of his confidence, one time we were on a trip to Costa Rica, and we were on the Pacific Ocean side, and he looked out and he said, "Ah, yes, the Caribbean Ocean." And we told him, no, this is the Pacific. Like, there is a Caribbean side. We said this is the Pacific side. He looked at us without flinching and said, "There is no Pacific side. Costa Rica is an island." And once my brother says something, he'll never give it up. So we all informed him, like, no, it's in Central America. We've been planning this trip for months. Like, nope, it's an island. So, anyways. Okay. I have a bit to say about the next section, but I think we can stop there. So I'll see you all on Thursday, and we'll continue with